Okay. Can you hear me? Is the mic on or not? It's on. Sweet. Okay, I know we're all hangry, so I'm going to go pretty quickly. I want to start with kind of the argument that Americans are living in alternative political realities. This is not just true of only Americans, of course, but it's the example I'm going to use. What do I mean by that? I mean that facts become fiction and fiction become facts, and the line between objective truth and subjective reality are blurred. I'll give you an example of some research we did documenting this. So this was back in COVID. What we actually did is we followed around 15 million Americans using their smartphones or GPS coordinates during COVID-19. And we looked at the degree that they were social distancing in terms of their movement. And not only did we look at that, but also how they're social distancing as a function of political partisanship. And what I mean by that is the voting record of the community that they are living in. This is what we found. We found that on average, Clinton voting counties, right, they reduce their movement more, as in they social distance more by around 15%. And you might say to me that's not very surprising, and I agree with you, given the rhetoric in the US, politically based rhetoric around COVID-19. But here is something that was quite surprising to us, and that is that partisanship, or the voting record of the community that people were living in, was a 6 times stronger predictor of their social distancing behavior than the actual COVID-19 infection rate in their community. This is pretty crazy, right? 6 times more powerful. My political identity of my community is determining my health behaviors that can literally lead to life and death, right? More so than the actual risk of infection. And I would say from that, it's just one example, there are many others, that Americans are in part living in these alternative realities that are at least politically formed, ideologically formed, formed by the political identity and the leaders of those political groups. So we lead to the question, where do these alternative realities come from, right? If we want to change the system, we want to change that some people are living in different realities that aren't entirely factual. How do we do that? One thing is to start at, where does it come from? What is the source of these realities? And as a professor in the Department of Organizational Behavior and Leadership, right? One of the things that comes to mind to me first is leaders, right? Political leaders, right? They construct these realities sometimes. And we've seen historically, right, that authoritarian, nationalist, fascist leaders are particularly skilled at creating these alternative realities, right? This kind of idea of doublethink from George Orwell's 1984, this idea of living in a different reality, having the truth in front of you, but still not recognizing it as the truth. And I think Hannah Arendt, the German philosopher and historian, kind of perfectly captures this by saying the ideal subject of totalitarian rule is people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction, the reality of the experience, no longer exists, right? Where truth has this gray zone, this blurred lines, right? I think we often forget that these types of governments not only restrict power, right? That they only restrict your freedoms, but they also blur the truth you experience from day to day. So this leads to this idea that political leaders, of course, can create these alternative realities, right, by peddling falsehoods, misinformation to a population that then trickles down and spreads among a community. But how can you actually quantify this, right? How can you look at this in an experimental way? And what we did is we prompt engineered GPT-4, so a large language model, to quantify the degree of falsehoods in political leaders' rhetoric. So these advancements in large language models let us literally, right, analyze natural language at scale. So I can put in millions and millions of statements of political leaders, and I can quantify the degree of misinformation in each one of those statements. Pretty cool. So one thing we did is we looked at US presidential speeches. So we took 26,000 excerpts of US presidential speeches. So an excerpt is like 2-3 sentences. And we had our large language model quantify each excerpt for the degree of misinformation, for the degree of falsehood. Here's an example. This is something Donald Trump said. He said, lawmakers in New York cheered with delight upon the passage of legislation that would allow a baby to be ripped from the mother's womb moments before birth. I don't need to tell you, this is a pretty false statement. Lawmakers in New York, in fact, did not do that. So our model rates each excerpt, or natural language, right, from a 1 to 7 scale, where 7 is the highest degree of falsehood, and our model very accurately captures this statement as false. It says the score is 7, and it says this statement reflects a very high degree of falsehood, yada, yada, yada. It's not supported by real-world evidence. Now that we have this tool, right, one thing we can do is we can look at how the degree of misinformation in US presidential speeches has changed over time, right? We can map it out in terms of each president. You might be able to tell there's an outlier, right? But I want to stress how large this outlier is, right? I don't think this is too unexpected, but I think the size of the effect is pretty outrageous. If you know anything about statistics, those little bars are standard errors. These ones are large because he died pretty quickly. But you can basically tell that this effect is absolutely enormous, right? This is not business as usual. It's not a small change. It's a seismic shift in the language of a political leader. We've also looked at applying our large language model in terms of quantifying misinformation in Germany. And what we did is we took around 100,000 tweets from the 2017 German election cycle, and we quantified each one of those tweets in terms of the degree of misinformation. And what we find is that the AfD, the alt-right political party in Germany, uses an enormous amount more misinformation and falsehoods, false statements in their social media posts than all other parties. And kind of to go against a false equivalency, the far left party, Die Linke, has far less falsehoods in their tweets. Now, this was in 2017, et cetera, but I think it kind of indicates that there is a specific propensity to engage in misinformation and falsehoods in the current far right. Now, you might say to me, Anton, that's all well and good. Very cool that you did this, but does it even matter? Are you just having a moral panic, right? There's this idea that maybe misinformation, false news, right, falsehoods, maybe they're not that big of a deal, right? Sometimes we read them, we think they're kind of funny, right? Maybe they don't have that much of an impact. So we explored the impact. Is there a potential impact? Can we quantify the impact of falsehoods in political rhetoric? So one thing we looked at, for instance, is we looked at whether falsehoods in US presidential speeches in a given year predicted violent political events in the subsequent year. So if a president uses more falsehoods, has more misinformation in their speeches, right, does that predict more violence, political violence, things like mobs, riots, assassination attempts the next year? And it does. We also find that the degree of falsehood in the German politicians' tweets predicts violent rhetoric in replies to those tweets. So the more falsehood, or the higher degree of falsehood in a tweet by a German politician, the more violent rhetoric we find in the replies to those tweets. And that's across party, actually. Here's another example. This is from the debate between Trump and Harris. What we do is we use our large language model to quantify the degree of misinformation in each of the statements in the debate. So for instance, this one is rated very high in misinformation, right? Because Haitian immigrants were in fact not eating your pet cat. What we do is we show these statements to participants, but we also show them more general policy statements that are rated low in misinformation from the debate. And what we find is that after reading the falsehoods, like the Springfield Haitians eating pets misinformation statement, participants tend to endorse support for political violence quite a bit more. Things like, oh, violence may be necessary to, preserve our country or to move our country forward, these kind of statements. And this is driven by an absolutely massive effect of political polarization in response to falsehoods as compared to these more general policy statements. And what I mean by political polarization is negative attitudes towards the political outgroup. So Democrats saying that, the Republicans are real bad people, and Republicans saying the Democrats are real bad people. I think these data can kind of help explain January 6th a bit, based on, quote, the big lie, right, that the election was stolen. And an interesting aspect of our data is that we actually find that the effects of these falsehoods on support for political violence and polarization, they exist across age of the participants, across gender, across employment, across whether people are married, right? It seems to be a very general effect. And this can kind of help explain why the perpetrators of January 6th were so diverse, right? They were of different ages. Most of them were married, had jobs. This is pretty unusual for political violence. In the field, the things we usually look at are lone attempts based on conspiracy theories of people who have a violent history and perhaps some indicators of mental illness. Now, of course, we still have some of these, of course, but on average, right, this is a different example of political violence, one being driven by an alternative political reality. And that is something I think we should be quite scared of. So, that being said, it's very difficult to change political leaders' rhetoric, right? I am not about to go get a grant where I can sit next to Donald Trump and tell him when he's lying. That is not going to happen. So, as a research group, we say, okay, maybe we can target a different level, right? If we want to deal with this problem, maybe we can attenuate the spread of falsehoods once they already exist, right? That people share these things more and more and more. And one way to look at this is to conduct a large-scale intervention on misinformation sharing. So basically what we did is we looked at what are different strategies we can use to get people to share less misinformation, right? To share less falsehoods online. And I'll give you an example of two of these interventions. One is a very classic warning label thing, right? It has a little flag or something that says, checked by independent fact checkers, this may be false. Another is media literacy tips. Here are just two, but generally it's like a list of 10 tips of how to spot false news. And I'm just going to focus on those two because they're particularly effective. They reduce the probabilities of sharing false news by around 10 to 15%. This is pretty effective. So we have some strategies that really work in terms of reducing the sharing of misinformation. There are tons of other strategies as well, right? We can apply AI misinformation classifiers. If we as a little lab can create a large language model that accurately identifies misinformation, right? Pretty sure Facebook can do it, right? We can also ban repeat offenders. So actually in 2016, 80% of the false news or misinformation about the US election was driven by 1% of Twitter users. These are very specific users. 35% of COVID misinformation was spread by around 800 users. We could ban them, right? Yet social media companies resist these solutions. They end fact-checking programs or become propaganda machines. So it's also very difficult to change the misinformation ecosystem, and you can just see our little research group getting more boxed into the corner and trying to solve this problem. And so we got to a very weird place, which was the following. We basically said, okay, what if we just let people hold false beliefs, but we try to reduce the harmful outcomes? So you can believe that vaccines cause autism, but don't do anything stupid. Still go get vaccinated and don't try to blow something up, right? And so the way to do this is we developed this theoretical model where we basically try to create a model around when do false beliefs actually lead to antisocial outcomes? When do people actually act on their false beliefs? And this is across different domains, so it can be health, politics, whatever. And what we say is that if you hold a false belief in something we call misplaced certainty, then that will lead to threat and therefore antisocial behavior. So let me explain what misplaced certainty is. It's basically holding a belief with complete certainty. And I really mean feeling like it's knowledge, right? No doubt, right? This kind of idea of felt knowledge. You really think it's objectively true. And it's that experience combined with perceived opposition towards the belief. So you think that there is evidence that counters or opposes your belief, and you think that the general consensus is against you in a way. So the structure, or the epistemic structure of misplaced certainty would be along the lines of, I am certain of, let's say, that vaccines cause autism, but I know it lacks evidence, right? I know that scientists generally disagree with me, right? There's that one paper I keep smashing in everyone's face, but that one's debunked. And most other people disagree with me, right? The public consensus is that vaccines do not cause autism. And this creates a really kind of weird epistemic psychological moment, right? Because I have this special knowledge. It's kind of the secret knowledge, right? I have this insight, and I'm so sure of it, but everyone else seems to either be hiding from the truth or trying to negate my truth, right? That's pretty uncomfortable. And we hypothesize that that state, that epistemic state of having certainty that is opposed by others, leads you to feel very threatened, right? Makes sense. You can imagine it, right? And we know from tons of research in psychology, right, that threat can lead to a fight response, an antisocial response, an aggressive response, right? Maybe support for political violence, things like these. Over 10 studies and thousands of participants have provided support for this model. I'll show you something that it kind of looks like. We usually include this as a control, so well-placed certainty would be certainty in something where I think most people agree with me, and there is evidence to support it, right? So if I'm certain that climate change is harmful, turns out most scientists agree with me, right? And actually, the public, on average, does agree with me, even in the US, right? So that's not very threatening. It's actually one of the reasons we might not be doing enough about climate change. It's because it's not very threatening. It's just nice. It's, everyone agrees with me. Somebody will take care of it. We also use misplaced belief. This is the same as misplaced certainty, but just without the complete certainty, right? So I have a bit of doubt. So I kind of think, oh, vaccines might cause autism, but I'm not entirely sure, right? But with misplaced certainty, if I know that vaccines cause autism and there's all this opposition, I experience a very high degree of threat. And this directly predicts my antisocial outcomes, how aggressively I respond, how much I support political violence, these types of outcomes. Based on this model, we can develop interventions, right, to kind of weaken the antisocial outcomes of false beliefs. So again, we're saying it's okay. You can hold your extremist false belief. Just don't do anything stupid. And how do we make sure that people don't do anything stupid? How do we make sure that they don't engage in antisocial outcomes? So one thing we can do is we can target the threat, right? If we know the threat leads to the antisocial outcomes, we can have people reappraise the situation, right, the belief that they have, to reduce threat. So for instance, you can tell them, oh, you know, it's okay that other people disagree with you. They're not trying to harm you. Or you can tell them, oh, you know, actually, in the future, everyone's going to agree with you that vaccines cause autism. Kind of a counterintuitive way of doing it. I wouldn't recommend it, but it actually will reduce threat. And when you do this, and you reduce the degree of threat produced by this misplaced certainty, this belief that you have, it also reduces the antisocial outcomes. So that's actually quite effective, right? You make people feel safe and secure, and then they won't act on their extremist false belief. Another thing you can do is you can introduce superordinate goals. It turns out that most Americans, for instance, think that the US is much more polarized than it actually is. They seem to forget sometimes that most Americans, even on opposite political ends, have the same goals, in the sense that they want a prosperous, happy society, right? But if you remind people about this, you can also turn off some of these effects. So remember the debate study I showed you? I actually hid a condition from you. So it turns out in one condition, after reading the falsehoods, like the Haitian pet eating thing, right? We told participants to think about how most Americans actually share the same goals, right? Even across political divides, most Americans want America to be a prosperous society where people are safe, et cetera, et cetera. And if you introduce these subordinate goals, if you have people reminded about these things, it turns off the effect of falsehoods or misinformation on support for political violence. So here are some takeaways. The first one is that alternative partisan realities or political realities exist. They really do. We've seen that in the COVID data. You can see that in a lot of other people's data. This is very well documented. And they have some severe consequences, right? In the case of the COVID study, I didn't mention this, but we actually tie it back to mortality. We literally tie it back to death. So more misinformation, right? More people engaging in the wrong types of health behaviors. They literally die more, right? That's a pretty big deal. Political leaders' rhetoric fuels these alternative realities, right? It really is in part created from the top down. Falsehoods spread by political leaders encourage political violence, right? The debate study, these kind of links to violence, so they do actually have pretty severe consequences. Warning labels and media literacy tips can reduce misinformation spread. We also know we could ban repeat offenders. We could create artificial intelligence driven algorithms that can quantify, pick out false information and ban it pretty easily, but we don't. But finally, right, when we're in this little corner that we're in and we say, uh-oh, this is pretty hard for us to deal with, maybe we can just turn off kind of the antisocial outcomes, the actions of those false beliefs. Maybe we have a chance to do that. And I'll leave you with the paradox of tolerance by Karl Popper. And the paradox of tolerance is basically that if we are in a tolerant society and we want our tolerant society not to be destroyed, we have to be intolerant of intolerance. So we cannot sit back and say, oh, let's tolerate anti-democratic sentiments or statements or false beliefs because in the name of free speech or in the name of whatever, right? If we do that, our tolerant society will be destroyed. And I think for too long, we have fallen into this trap when it comes to false beliefs, misinformation spread, fake news in a sense, right? We treat this as free speech, despite that it has a clear potential for harm. I think I've shown you that it has a clear potential for harm. And we regulate things that can harm us in society all the time, right? We regulate how we can drive. We regulate the food we eat. All these things we regulate. Yet for some reason, we've decided that misinformation doesn't count. But it does, right? It has all these potential harms. And just to be clear, I am not suggesting we do this when the fox is already in the henhouse, right? We should not go to the US and be like, you guys should create regulation to manage the misinformation right now, right? That would probably be a bad idea given that, again, the fox is already in the henhouse. The tolerant society is no longer tolerant. But we still have an opportunity here, right? Before the fox enters the henhouse. And so I would very much recommend that we need to create some sort of regulations that can help steer misinformation away from social media platforms and from other aspects on the internet where people really end up having this biased outcome. Just to give you one last little example, in Germany, for instance, if you go on Instagram or X and all you do is follow the main political parties, you don't do anything else, you don't look at anything, you don't scroll, you will get 9 times more positive AfD content. This isn't free speech. This isn't, oh, we are trying to, oh, we're not letting people speak. This is a biased algorithm. It's propaganda. And we need to not fool ourselves that our tolerant society is under attack. All right, cool. Thanks.
Thank you a lot, Anthony. I think it was a very good reminder about what you call the misinformation ecosystem and how we fight that. Thank you very much. Ok, da det lunsj. Ja, og det opp ut der til venstre, og jeg håper alle er tilbake her 13:20. Ta god lunsj.